Welcome once again. Does everyone have a plate of food? Good. So, sorry for the delay, but we're going to get started now. What I'd like to do first of all is to introduce our director, our new director for ABC, which is Dr. Patricia Lespinasse. And I always forget to say, for those who want to say who I am, for those who don't know me, my name is Fabian Burrell. Welcome again.
Good evening.
Good evening.
That's not good enough. Good evening.
Good evening.
Much better. I mean, I fed you. So let's try one more time. Good evening.
Good evening.
That's it. Welcome to our inaugural panel, The Fire This Time, the lasting impact of James Baldwin's writing. When we're thinking about James Baldwin, some of you are new to his writing. Particularly my students. So I'd like to thank my students for coming out this evening and for opening up their minds. And I always tell them, I'm not trying to change your mind, I'm trying to open it. And so thank you to the students who are here. Give yourselves a round of applause. And thank you to everyone else who's here as well. I would like to first and foremost, thank the faculty and staff of CABCS, Ms. Tony Burden, our heart and soul, and also Ms. Fabian Burrell, our coordinator of programming and community engagement. Without those two, we would be nothing. Please give them a round of applause. I'd also like to thank Dr. Davis, who's traveling. He's at a conference. Dr. Naylor, Dr. DeCanto, Dr. Springer, Dr. Simone Allegra, who is here with us, my faculty. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, the English Department and the Center for Academic Support and Enrichment, and the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. Of course, the Honors College is always on our side. And I'd like to thank Dr. Marcia Darling, who is here, she was the first director of the CABCs, and so thank you for your support. Thank you, Dr. Darling. And I'd also like to recognize, of course, our Dean of Arts and Science, Dr. Vincent Wong. And our Provost, Chris Storm. I'd like to invite Chris Storm to say a few words. Thank you. Let's welcome him.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Lespinasse. I just want to extend a tremendous welcome to everyone here. This is a very particularly special Baldwin lecture because it does mark a centennial, and as mentioned also, it's the inaugural panel. And I think that's a great innovation because for our students and participants, you'll be able to engage in dialogue and to hear more perspectives and voices. So I hope you're really looking forward to a very intellectually stimulating evening. I also want to extend particular compliments to all of our students who are here. It can be very difficult to break out of your day-to-day and come out to an academic lecture. You have so much going on with your coursework that you took the time and invested in yourself to come here to this event. I think that's really meaningful, and you're really getting the most out of the university in your education. So I hope that you enjoy tonight. I hope you come to future events, and that this really becomes a hallmark of what Adelphi has to offer, and what you're doing for yourself to grow and to learn. So with that, thank you. Looking forward to the panel.
So before we get to our illustrious panel, I just want to let you all know that we are celebrating Baldwin through the fall and into the next semester. Just to give you an idea of what we're doing, our next event will be on October 16th and will feature a distinguished lecture by another American writer and activist, Kevin Powell, author of 14 books and star of the first reality television show, Real World. Mr. Powell will deliver the annual James Baldwin Distinguished Lecture on Literary and Social Criticism in the UC Ballroom. Everyone is invited. Also in October, we have a screening and a student-run panel and a discussion of the film I Am Not Your Negro, and this panel will be co-sponsored by the Creative Writing Club. In November, we will also screen the film, The Price of the Ticket, and this event will feature director Karen Thorson in conversation with Greg Miller, who is here this evening. We will also have an art exhibit that will feature artist Sabrina Nelson. The exhibit is entitled The Frontline Prophet, James Baldwin, and this exhibition consists of unique works birthed from Nelson's meditation on James Baldwin and a 91-day commitment to simply draw Baldwin's essence. So you will see her work over a period of 91 days and her commitment to Baldwin. The exhibition will begin in Squirrel Library Gallery and it will end here in the UC Ballroom during January and February. On December 5th, we will have a tribute to Baldwin by Scylla Owens and the Jazz Ensemble here at Adelphi University in the PAC. And last but not least, in Alumni Hall on December 7th, we will have a theatrical performance that pays homage to Baldwin, directed by our very own professor, Dr. Naylor, and that will be in Alumni Hall. So we look forward to seeing you all at these events, and we look forward to celebrating Baldwin with you. When we're thinking about Baldwin, I'd like to first contextualize him and sort of give you an idea of who Baldwin was. And so I invited one of my wonderful students, Debare Ologun, and he will be doing Baldwin's bio and then playing a short film about Baldwin, just so that we get a sense of Baldwin. And then I will introduce our panelists and begin our discussion. Debare, please welcome him.
Thank you, Dr. Lespinasse. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
James Baldwin, born August 2nd, 1924, and died December 1st, 1987, was an essayist, novelist, and playwright whose eloquence and passion on the subject of race in America made him one of the most important voices in the 20th century. A writer of exceptionally clear and psychologically penetrating prose, Baldwin addressed race relations with depth, complexity, and incisive anger. He was also one of the first Black writers to include queer themes in fiction, notably in Giovanni's Ring, writing with a frankness that was highly controversial at the time. His works include the novels Go Tell It on the Mountain and Another Country, the plays The Amen Corner and The Blues for Mr. Charlie, and the essay collections Nobody Knows My Name and The Fire Next Time. Have you enjoyed the video?
Novelist, playwright, poet, and essayist, James Baldwin emerged as the spokesman of the civil rights movement.
James Baldwin is considered such a great author because he was so skilled at eloquently describing what it was like to be Black in America.
Born on August 2nd, 1924, in Harlem, New York, James Arthur Baldwin was a Pentecostal preacher at age 14, left the church 3 years later, and was already an accomplished writer. When disgusted by prejudice against African Americans, he left the United States and moved to Paris in 1948.
James Baldwin earned a writing fellowship, and he used that money to buy a ticket and leave immediately for Paris.
He left in part because he felt he couldn't write freely or honestly in America. And perhaps more particularly, he couldn't write freely or honestly from the ghetto.
In Europe, Baldwin completed Go Tell It on the Mountain, one of Modern Library's 100 best English-language novels of the 20th century.
Go Tell It on the Mountain was an important novel, in part because there were not many novels being widely read about Black urban life from the perspective of Black people.
The semi-autobiographical tale really discusses in a profound way issues having to deal with family relationships, organized religion, human sexuality. It was certainly one of the finest books published in America.
In 1958, he wrote Giovanni's Room, a controversial novel that featured only white characters and explicit homoerotic content.
Giovanni's Room is one of the first novels in American literature to tackle the issue of homosexuality. When he published that novel, that was a daring thing to do. That was a taboo topic.
Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time, published in 1963, discussed the uneasy relationship between Christianity and the Black Muslim movement within the Civil Rights Movement, and landed him on the cover of Time magazine.
In 1963, he may well have been the most powerful and most compelling and most widely recognized literary voice in terms of his essays, in terms of his relatively popular fiction. He was the voice that was calling America's attention to the prejudice and the racism that persisted in society.
It was the year of Dr. King's historic speech, the March on Washington. Everybody read The Fire Next Time. It was an angry outcry at the racism going on in the United States and the burgeoning civil rights movement.
With the assassination of major civil rights leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, Baldwin returned to Europe, where he lived most of his adult life, and continued to reflect the racial upheaval of America through his work.
In addition to novels and essays, James Baldwin was a playwright. He wrote criticism. He even published some film criticism. He was what you might call a creative journalist. He looked into the Atlanta child murders late in his career and wrote a series of powerful essays about those.
As a resident of France, Baldwin was given that country's highest honor, Commander of the Legion of Honor. He died from stomach cancer on November 30th, 1987, in Saint-Paul-de-Vence, France, and was buried in Harlem, New York.
His writings had an enormous impact on American society. He reflected the times and remains a powerful source for an understanding of a vital period of our national history, the Civil Rights Movement, the most important moral crusade of the late 20th century.
Thank you, Debara. Another round of applause for Debara. When we're thinking about Baldwin, as the bio brought out, that 1962 New Yorker magazine gave over almost all of its issue to a long article by Baldwin on the Black Muslim separatist movement and other aspects of the civil rights struggle. The article, along with a letter to his nephew that was published in the Progressive to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, became a bestseller in book form as, of course, The Fire Next Time. When we're thinking about this work, it was explosive and profound. Its social influence had no bounds. And taking its title from a Black spiritual, the essay closed in prophetic terms. Quote, if we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious Blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others, do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy, recreated from the Bible in a song by a slave, is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water, the fire next time. Please welcome Professor Susan Dinan and Professor Abdullah-Matta to the stage. Unfortunately, Professor Blint could not join us. He is sick after traveling, and so he will not be with us tonight, but we send well wishes to him. Professor Dinan is Dean of the Honors College and Professor of History at Adelphi University. Her research interests focus on women and poor relief in Catholic Reformation France. She is immediate past president of the National Collegiate Honors Council and past president of the Northeast Regional Honors Council. Please welcome Professor And Professor Abdullah-Matta is a poet and professor of English at CUNY LaGuardia, the Graduate Center and Hunter College, as well as Adelphi University. Sometimes we can pull her and get her over here, where she teaches composition, literature, creative writing, Africana, and women, gender, and sexuality studies courses. She writes about the culture and history of Black women and explores the presence of Black bodies and voices in fine art and poetry. Welcome.
Good evening. I am not an expert on James Baldwin, as you might have discerned from the introduction. And when Fabian first asked me to be part of the panel, my inclination was to say, no, thank you. But I didn't, and in part I didn't because, as a dean, I'm interacting with students all the time, and I'm always encouraging them to take academic risks, and I'm always encouraging them to figure out ways in which they have the opportunity to learn more. And so it struck me that I was going to need to sort of, walk the walk if I was going to talk the talk, and that the right thing to do would be to come and be part of this evening, in part because it is a learning experience, but also I think because as an historian, I'm very interested in the argument that James Baldwin is making about history and memory and the importance of understanding history to advance sort of civilization. So when I read and reread The Fire Next Time, I was reading it through the lens of an historian and an historian of the Reformation. And so the time period that I study is one that was tremendously violent. Europe was just pulled apart during the Reformation. And the rhetoric that came from just about everyone, be they religious leaders, be they civic leaders, was very provocative and very divisive. And what struck me as I was reading the essays again was that we have James Baldwin, and he spent his youth as a Christian pastor. He writes in depth about what it was like to go and to meet with Elijah Muhammad and to sit down and speak with members of the Nation of Islam. But he doesn't adopt the language of either of these groups. He doesn't talk about whites as being unsavable. He doesn't talk about them as devils. Instead, he has a language that strikes me as being much more full of grace. One that allows space, perhaps, for the transformation of people. It strikes me as I spend a lot of time with historians. I don't think I've ever met someone who was so optimistic in their understanding of what a better interpretation of history could lead us to. And so I come to Baldwin's letters interested in people who can transcend rhetoric and people who can think beyond sort of the immediate, and in the case of what I study, sort of very, very violent language. People didn't do this in the 16th and 17th centuries. Europe plunged into decade upon decade of vicious civil war. And then the violence traveled with the Europeans, because as they went out to colonize land and eventually build their empire, they imposed upon everybody they were encountering sort of their understanding of religion. And then they brought with them the wars that they had been fighting at home. So, there's a long history of these divides, and I will remind you that the Good Friday Accords were not signed until 1998, right? So this internecine warfare, this has a long history. And so we have at least from my perspective, of my area of interest, an example that is sort of what happens when people are not necessarily open to interpretations of history that are not grounded only in their own experience. And so when I read The Fire Next Time and sort of think about that first essay to his nephew, I'm so interested in James Baldwin's conclusions about sort of these white people who he and his nephew are encountering. And they're tacit, they're formal, their acceptance of these racist practices and institutions. And what he concludes as their inability to understand their own history. He argues that as whites dehumanize blacks, they debase themselves. And so there's an urgency for everyone, for whites to take on the responsibility of understanding their history. Now, personally, I find this idea of, be it a forgotten or a misunderstood history, to be quite important. I think it can explain a lot about all of our past. But I think at this moment, when our understanding of history and our ability to study history is fraught, it is helpful for us perhaps to think about his more optimistic understanding of what history can do. So I just, from the letter to his nephew, he writes, "There is no reason for you to try to become like white men, and there is no basis whatever for their impertinent assumption that they must accept you. The really terrible thing, old buddy, is that you must accept them. And I mean that very seriously. You must accept them and accept them with love. For these innocent people have no other hope. They are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand, and until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. They have had to believe for many years, and for innumerable reasons, that black men are inferior to white." And I find it so striking that he categorizes this white population as innocent. And he puts into sort of the passive voice what it is they don't understand. It's not blame, it's not looking out, but rather trying to think about problem solving and recognizing sort of the need for people to come together to solve the problem. I don't understand how one is that full of grace, given the experience he writes about in the second letter, the second part of the book, right? What he's treated, with the police when he runs in with a 10 at 14, and what he sees around him. But he brings to this problem of racism and prejudice sort of an understanding that it is about love, is it about knowledge, it is about education that can move us forward. Now, obviously, from, as we saw it briefly in the video, 1962, when Baldwin is writing the letters, we're in the midst of the civil rights movement in the United States, which is challenging some of the racist institutions of the country. This led some whites to prematurely celebrate success and others to sort of retrench into racist beliefs and practices. I think that we might argue that some of the same outcomes have come out of the Black Lives Matter movement more recently. And we might, I think as we look at this now from the 21st century, we might want to think about whether perhaps we're in a position to learn from our history better than people have in the past. Is there reason to hope? Now you may think me delusional, but I think maybe there is. Now, I'm saying this right in the face that in January of last year, Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida banned the teaching of AP African American Studies because it lacked, as he said, educational value and historical accuracy. South Carolina and Arkansas have also banned the course. In the same year, in public schools in Florida, history teachers were told that they had to teach children the new educational standard that said that blacks benefited from slavery and that slaves, and this is the language, developed skills which in some instances could be applied to their social benefit. It goes on, right? These same standards also argue that the violence perpetrated in race massacres, and it says the violence perpetrated against and by African Americans is not limited to 1906 Atlanta race riot, the 1919 Washington, D.C. riot, the 1920 OC massacre, and the 1921 Tulsa massacre. So now, on the one hand, we cannot come to understand our history if we are told lies, and we cannot come to understand our history if the history we are told is cherry-picked from very specific examples to align with a particular political agenda. So I don't mean to in any way say that these developments are not critically important. But interesting, the American Historical Association has sent out a survey and polled thousands of middle and high school teachers from across the country. And they looked at states like Alabama, Colorado, Connecticut, Illinois, Iowa, Pennsylvania, Texas, Virginia, and Washington. And what they found was that when they interviewed people who taught American history, the teachers themselves overwhelmingly affirmed that they were able to talk about multiple sides of different historical events, that they could depict U.S. history, and the language that the AHA used was as a complex mix of accomplishments and setbacks. 2% of the faculty members surveyed said that they frequently heard complaints from community members about how it is that they taught. But that's 2%, and I think we might have supposed that it would be higher. Now, the situation is not perfect. We all studied American history in our schools, and I imagine we had experiences that were certainly troubling at times. But if we think about the moment right now, as of January of this year, 2024, the AP African American Studies course is being taught in 700 schools across 40 states. Now, I know that this class has been watered down in the face of political opposition. I recognize that it is not, it is not the perfect course. But it is certainly something that was, it was not even conceivable when I was in high school, and was very hard, I think, for people to conceive of perhaps more than 10 years ago that such a class would be offered by, at the AP level, and then brought into universities. We are living at a time when books are being banned left, right, and center. But we also have responses to those book bannings. The New York Public Library makes their library cards available and free to everyone in the country under the age of 18. So any kid who wants to get their hands on any audiobook or ebook can do so by simply writing to the New York Public Library and asking for it. Again, I'm not saying it's a perfect solution, but I'm saying that there is pushback. And so I wonder if perhaps there aren't spaces now for us to kind of negotiate our understanding of the present and the past, and for us to think more carefully about the way that our pasts are kind of shaping our world today. Baldwin writes later in his letter, and these men are your brothers, your lost younger brothers. And if the word integration means anything, this is what it means. That we with love shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and to begin to change it. For this is your home, my friend. Do not be driven from it. Great men have done great things here and will again, and we can make America what America must become. Now, arguably, this is still our task, and we sit a month and a half away from an election that's going to tell us the direction of America pretty clearly. But it strikes me that it is possible, that it is possible that we might be able to think about history in a way that is more restorative, that is better for allowing us to ground our present moment. And that we might be able to consider the grace in which Baldwin was looking upon, people who had perpetrated tremendous acts of hate against him and against, all in his communities. And think about the spaces in which we might be able to afford one another some of that grace. So thank you.
Oh, that's not her?
No? I wrote it. Oh, you got it, okay.
You want the light stand for the PowerPoint?
Can you give it to
That would be good, or just a little, maybe. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I hate mics.
If you don't need it.
No, I'm teasing. I'm not teasing, but I need it. It always makes me like self-conscious. Am I talking too loud? Am I saying? So let's see. Is that good for you? Okay, so the whole time my colleague there was speaking, I kept thinking, are we going to pick the same quotes, right? Because there's so much so much of his work that really resonates with us today. And each quote, I was like, is that the quote I'm going to use too? But it wasn't, so that's so cool. All right, so I want to start by talking about these images. So that image on the left is a photograph that I took at the African American Museum of History and Culture. And I think it really kind of contextualizes how I'm thinking about Baldwin, right? Because there's the historical shots on the left, then we see Zora Neale Hurston next to him in the image, and it just really, the entire image shows this kind of collectivity of African American history and culture, right, and storytelling. And the image on the right, I also took that photograph at the African American Museum, is a drum. Right? And so I think that for me, the drum symbolizes a lot of things from, those of us from African descent, we know the drum is important, but also in indigenous cultures. And, the drum is a circle, right, where people can, communicate through music, song, and storytelling. So I just thought it would be interesting, these two pieces from the museum, which is only about 6 or 7 years old, I think, that really showcases all of that history. Okay. So this discussion focuses on the significance of Baldwin in the here and now. It considers how Baldwin's politics and poetics serve as critique and witness of the Black condition and predicament then and now. And I think that I was really happy to hear the intro and the clips, right? It kind of contextualized where Baldwin was, and my colleague also talking about American history. So I want you to think about, I'm just picking up from there. So Baldwin's politics and poetics serve as a critique and witness of the Black condition, predicament then and now, in the US and in the global society. Baldwin's essays, fiction, and poetry continue to instruct us. His work provides an important blueprint to writers, students, and scholars who are in the business of documenting Black culture, humanity, politics, and truth-telling. And those are the 4 kind of things I want to talk about a little bit. And I'm glad that there are students here, because I'm going to talk about some of the work that I do with my students centering Baldwin. So novelist, essayist, playwright, poet, and social critic James Baldwin lives in our hearts, minds, and spirits. His work remains quite relevant today, though 2024 marks the 100th year of his birth. And so here I have the 2 collections, The Fire Next Time, which is constantly in reprint. And that says a lot about his relevance to us, right? Because that book is constantly reprinted. And then The Fire This Time, edited by Jesmyn Ward, who is writing this as a kind of 21st century discussion about some of the same things that Baldwin was pointing to, and some of the things that are happening in our society now. Baldwin's The Fire Next Time from 1963 inspired the collection The Fire This Time, which was published in 2016, edited by Jesmyn Ward, who wanted to create and curate a space to hold the frustration and outrage of the murders of young Black men due to police and state-sanctioned violence. In the introduction, Ward discusses the significance of Trayvon Martin's death in terms of the mainstream American societal narrative that saw young Trayvon as, quote, nothing more than a wayward thug, as opposed to a young human being who was violently murdered because of the color of his skin. Ward turned to Baldwin's work for comfort and, in her words, to, quote, find a way out of a dark closet. The dark closet of American racism, police violence, and the senseless murder of young Black boys and men. And so I just would offer students that, you get a chance, you should definitely look at the 2 texts in comparison, and because it really does situate this unfortunately long and tragic history of the condition of Black people in America, but also really trying to unpack it in ways that hopefully give us hope, right? Which is what we need to do, right? Or who knows where we'll be. Ward found solace and meaning in my judgeship, letter to my nephew on the 100th anniversary of the emancipation. And that entire title is really important, right? Because it's the 100th anniversary of emancipation, which we're talking about, to the Civil War. And was struck by Baldwin's warning to his nephew and to the rest of us. Quote, you can only be destroyed by believing that you really are what the white world calls, quote, and I don't use that word. I tell you this because I love you, and please don't you ever forget it. Baldwin quoted by Ward, this is quoted by Ward. Her response to these words and Baldwin's honesty about, one, the conditions of that Black people face in America, and two, the need to create a space of solace for young people navigating the system of racism in America that would codify and reinforce that they mattered, they were loved, and they should never forget this, right? So this image, of course, is Trayvon Martin, it's Tamir Rice, and Sonia Massey. So these are just three of the people that Ward kind of talks about in her introduction. Ward instructs, I hope this book makes each one of you, dear readers, feel as if we were sitting together, you and me, Baldwin and Treadway, and Wilkerson and Jeffers and Walters and Anderson and Smith. And these are some of the writers that wrote it, that submitted things for the Fire this time. And it's a combination of poets, essayists, right? So a lot of different folks writing across genres. So the names I said, and all the serious, clear-sighted writers were here in the Fire this time. And that we are composing our story together. That we are writing an epic wherein Black lives carry worth. Wherein Black boys can walk to the store and buy candy without thinking they will die. Wherein Black girls can have a bad day and be mouthy without being physically assaulted by a police officer. Wherein cops see 12-year-old Black boys playing with fake guns as silly kids and not homicidal maniacs. Wherein Black women can stop to ask for directions without being shot in the face by paranoid white homeowners. I burn and I hope. The authors mentioned represent some of the collected pieces in the Fire this time, which pledges to do what Baldwin did in his work, call out American injustice, and to remind the Black community that we are in fact worthy of being treated with human dignity, and to insist that America can do better. So now I'd like to just share this clip, and I just love finding images of Baldwin. He was so stylish. I'll talk a little bit more about how he means other things to me after this. So in this clip, he is on the Dick Cavett show. So my dear students.
No question of what happens to the Negro here, to the Black man.
No, we don't want that.
So that's a very good question to me. But the real question is what happens to color. Now, the Negroes, don't seem to be very optimistic. It's not because they suddenly all change from happy.
Okay. So before I start this, I just want to say to you, dear students, that the Dick Cavett show is like the Jimmy Kimmel show now. And it's like the Jimmy Fallon show, right? It's like the Tonight Show. It's, so it's just like, so I want you to think about the fact that this image, this person, this writer is really in the popular culture, right? And seen on a Tonight Show. So I'm just going to play a couple of minutes, and I just want you to know, I'm not going to try to make it bigger because I might mess it up, but so we'll start.
Hear me. Well, I'm sure you still need the remark that what are the Negroes, why aren't they optimistic? And again, I apologize and preface this by the phrase the Negroes because it lumps together an awful lot of people. You and Floyd McKissick and Madam Clayton Powell and Hattie McDaniel and Jackie Robinson and it's impossible, I suppose, but for want of a better phrase, you'll allow me. They said, but it's getting so much better. There are Negro mayors. There's Negroes in all sports. There are Negroes in politics. There are even accorded the ultimate accolade of being television commercials now. I'm glad you're smiling. Is it at once getting much better and still hopeless?
Well, I don't think much hope for it, it's paid, as long as people are using this peculiar language. And so I was trying to say before, I said, there's no question of what happens to the Negro here, to the black man here. And that's a very big question to me, But the real question is what's going to happen to this country. I have to repeat that. Now, the Negroes, don't seem to be very optimistic. It's not because they suddenly all changed from happy shifters, dancing donkeys down the levee, like cotton, singing praises to the master. They're not changed at all. They're more optimistic. All one's got to do is listen to Someone Sweet Chariot and ask yourself what that song's about. Or try to really listen to what Ray Charles is really telling you. We have lived under these intolerable conditions for how many years? Maybe 400 years. We have evolved a certain kind of style to read it, and a lot of that has been involved with the lies that it tells to you, and the lies that it tells you is compounded with that you believe because you wanted to believe it. But obviously you knew, every white man knows, that he would not himself, lie and cat for nothing. He would not himself allow his child to be sold from his own child or you. He would not himself allow himself not to have the autonomy of his own house and his own woman. He would not himself to go that confident carriage to market just because he loves white people. We all know that. And the word Negro in this country really is designed to disguise the fact that when it's talking about another man, a man like you, who wants what you want. And insofar as American Public wants to think there's been progress, there was one very simple thing. I don't want to be given anything by you. I just want you to leave me alone so I can do it myself. And it also looks another very important thing. Perhaps I don't think that this republic is the summit of human civilization. Perhaps I don't want to become like Ronald Reagan or like President General Motors. Perhaps I have another sense of life, which in fact my situation here has forced me to trust. And perhaps I know more about you and your institution than you know about me. And perhaps I have a judgment on them. Perhaps I don't want what you think I want. And then there's something you can give me. Perhaps there's something that I can give you.
So I'll just stop it there, but I think that it's very important to kind of hear Baldwin today. In terms of what I do in terms of how Baldwin impacts me in the work that I do, I also am not a Baldwin scholar. Most of my work is around Black women and poetry. However, I use Baldwin all the time in teaching composition, and I go back to it over and over. And if you took a look at my book, it's all these marks, it's practically falling apart, because he's an exemplary writer, and in the ways in which he uses the epistolary form, right, writing those letters, and then just his essay format. So I find that it's a solid example of showing students how to construct a well thought out and supported essay, and also the content and the context still applies to what we're experiencing today in the U.S. And so I think it's very important to unpack that. And often, of course, like I know you folks didn't know, or the young people didn't know about the Dick Cavett show, right? And it's important to understand like where he stands and where he would be in today's culture, right? In popular culture, and that. So I think it's important to read his work and then to hear his work. So often when I'm teaching, I have them read an essay first, and then I show them a clip, and then I also spend a lot of time looking at Fifth Avenue Uptown, which those of you who don't really know that essay, he's really talking about the way Harlem is changing, and that relates to how our city, our areas in our cities are gentrifying now. So there's a real connection to what he's talking about. I think Fifth Avenue Uptown was written in 1958, I can't remember, but there's a real connection to what he's saying then and what we experience in the world and community now. And the other thing I think is really important about not just what he says, it's how he says it. It's his expert skill at description, right? And how he talks about the projects, how he talks about the other side of the boulevard, the same way he does in everything that he writes in The Fire Next Time. So for me, it's important to situate Baldwin in the 21st century, and I know that we can all still learn and get a lot of truth from his work. Now let's see if I can navigate back to this. Look at me. So this is one of my favorite quotes of Baldwin. If one can reach back, reach down into oneself, into one's life, and find there's some witness, however unexpected or ambivalent to one's reality, no one will be enabled, though perhaps not very spiritedly, to face another day. And so just like Susan was talking about, this idea of hope, to really go back and understand, but also to let that allow you to have the strength to kind of move forward. So I'm going to share two more things about Baldwin I think are important. So when I was a student in Paris, as a junior in college, is when I started reading James Baldwin, because I was in this environment where, well, first of all, I was in Paris, right? You know, like I lived in Paris and Switzerland. But also I was in this environment that, you know, as an African-American student studying French literature, don't ask me why, I was in an environment where I didn't have my community and my family, right? And when I was a student in Paris, I couldn't afford to come home for Thanksgiving and Christmas. My parents were like, you go when you stay and see you in the summer. So that's what happened. And so I reached for the works of African-American writers, and in particular, Baldwin. That was the first time I read The Fire This Time. And then, you know, again, I've read and looked at it, you know, throughout since then. And then when I went to grad school many, many, many years later, James Baldwin had taught at UMass, and my department, I did a PhD in African American Studies, would always talk about, oh, this was Jimmy's department. They called him Jimmy, and they would talk about the way he shepherded students, right? They always had to give him a bigger classroom because he'd walk on campus and say, come to my class, come, 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 and people followed him. And to think about his influence on folks who are not just scholars and who are creatives, such as myself, Susan Lloyd Parks, who's written a number of plays, and she's, you know, been all over, says that it was Baldwin that encouraged her to write plays when she was a student. I think she was at either Mount Holyoke or Hampshire, but in that Fire College area. So I think it's important for us to be able to take these texts and look at what they mean then, how people are drawing on them now, like you saw in The Fire This Time, and how we're still trying to navigate the politics of race, you know, racial discrimination, racial oppression, violence in this country today. And for me, at the end of it, it's about telling the truth. It's about understanding our history, our collective history as folks that live in the United States, as human beings, and also our history, our particular histories, right? The histories that, you know, correspond to our own families and cultures, and to do something with that. So what I would like to do now is share a poem where this is a longer poem. It's a zuhitsu, so I'm just going to read a piece of it. And so I would say that Baldwin and other writers like him, and I could go down a long, long list, still influence this idea of truth-telling that a lot of creatives, you know, and that's what poets are trying to do, right? They're trying to tell the truth. So I'm going to share this with you. It's from a longer piece called Black Print. Freedom is the myth. We supposed to be free. No more forced exile for my fam. Can eat what, trigger warning, can eat what the fuck I want, when the fuck I want. Well, maybe work less if I want, though perhaps not true. Education helps some, but us is not really free. My grandma and grandpa didn't work that cotton, that rice, that tobacco, hot fields in summer with no breaks, work at the break of dawn in the fields, pop out baby, pass afterbirth and pick cotton. They worked in people's houses and kitchens, in factories, at the Social Security, at the Board of Ed. In another time and place, in the night, I listen through the floor, listen for my big man son, Listen to hear his footsteps on wood floor or the vibes of his TV, the hum of his AC. Free to sleep today. He made it home tonight without police altercation, without handcuffs, without bullet hole entries and exits, through his ginger brown skin. How free is free? What has become of us? To share that piece because it does really contextualize thinking about our history, thinking about how being really still fearing for our boys. I raised 3 sons and luckily things are good, but doesn't mean that I haven't worried a lot. And so I think that all of the things that Baldwin is trying to teach us is to be better, right? And to treat each other with unity. Thank you. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to invite our panelists back up, and what I'll do now is I'll take questions from the audience since we're running a little behind. I know some students have to leave. So if you have a question, or a comment.
Likes, dislikes, no.
Yes.
Did either one of you find that did either one of you find that Baldwin became more optimistic after he traveled to Europe? Did that have an impact on him seeing America in a different light?
Yeah. You wanna?
Well, very quickly. I mean, I think that that he leaves and he goes the first time, and I do think he comes back somewhat more optimistic, and he comes back into a movement, the civil rights movement that is growing. But then I think he returns because it isn't like I thought it was going to be. His sort of disgust and frustration remains.
Yeah, I mean, I would say 2 things about the travel abroad, right? It made him, it allowed him to be freer to speak the truth, and also it allowed him to look back at America and process what was happening very differently than had he stayed. I do think though, when he was working on I'm Not Your Negro, I think that he was, I think that I don't know if I even like the word optimistic. I think that he still believed that we could, get some dignity and learn from things, because he, in that film, you guys are screening that, right? Yeah. Yeah, it's a must look at, right? He looks at Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and I forgot the third person. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, right? So he looks at the 3 assassinations, and he's really contextualizing what was going on to lead to that. And I think that even talking about that and getting, really unpacking that is a sign of hope, right? And that to give people encouragement after even these 3 assassinations, some folks are still working and trying to gain, civil rights and freedom. And so I think he was, what I hear from my professors when I was in grad school, and I went to grad school a little later, so it was already after he was deceased, they talk about how spirited he was, and how he thought writing was everything, and that it was a tool of social transformation. So I think so. I think so.
First of all, thank you for doing this, and I didn't know that there would be more events happening as well. That's great. So my question kind of has to do with that, in that I know it depends from state to state in the United States with different curriculums, but at least when I was in high school, I never was taught anything about James Baldwin. Even I played Trivial Pursuit a few days ago. My dad, who's 6 years old, he had never heard of James Baldwin before. That was one of the questions, and he told about Patricia himself about things, but he hadn't even heard of him. So do you think there's a reason why maybe he's not in the consciousness of Americans as much as someone like Malcolm X or Martin Luther King? Is it maybe something to do with assassinations, maybe more, you know, you can get what I'm saying, you know? So yeah, do you think there's maybe a reason for that, or?
You know, that's a call and response, right? What you said, I'm like, oh my goodness, that's a really good question. Would you like to answer?
No.
No. I think a couple of things. I think one, that depending on where you go to school, where you have the privilege to go to school, that our curriculum doesn't offer those texts for a reason, because they're important. I think that we are no longer a reading culture, right? And so, I mean, my grandmother, who never went to college, read Native Son, read James Baldwin, right? Because we were a reading culture and you read what was popular. And so I think it depends on what you have access to, whether or not you would come across it other than in a classroom, which is problematic, right? So I think that's one of the reasons. I think that, so, you know, I studied African American studies, and we know, like, there's like the authors that everybody knows, right? They know Maya Angelou, they know Langston Hughes, they know Richard Wright, and they may know Toni Morrison, right? And so it's this way that in American letters, right, Black authors have been positioned in a particular way. So it is some about time and place, but I would argue that there's still a lot of people reading him because his books are still in print. And that means that they're still important, right? Or they reprint them. But again, if you're not seeking it, you may not come across it. Now, my children would argue something very different, right? Because I had them in it, whether they got it in school or not. So it depends on what you have access to. You'll find, if you Google James Baldwin right now, you're gonna find like the top 25 quotes. And people will look at that, and then but they won't actually dive into the text. So that would be my answer. But I'm happy that you are interested.
Yeah, I know about him from I'm Like a Negro. I watched that documentary.
Yeah.
So that's all I know.
Yeah. And read his, are you a student? You're a student, yes. Right? So I would really read his work because he's a really powerful writer. I mean, he's one of the best to model in terms of rhetorical strategy, supporting essays. So even just for that, I think that he's really important in that way. And but thanks for your question.
But it's a complexity of language, right? That I think if we become increasingly more concerned about the text that we put before students, because there's a reticence to read, but as more things become more complex and more challenging to read, people's willingness to take the time to really kind of unpack and engage with those texts dwindles. And so I think it may also be that we do ourselves a disservice by not putting forward the more challenging texts. And then if you read something more narrative, like Giovanni's Room, which is beautiful, I mean, then all of a sudden you've got these men, and so that's going to make people nervous for all these other reasons. And so there's also...
Yeah. I think too, though, it's interesting because a number of his essays have been widely anthologized in composition textbooks for I don't know what your writing 101 classes, but whatever that is, that curriculum, a lot of, select, right, essays have been anthologized. So, and I think too, sometimes people just, in terms of this, like, so what do you decide to do in a curriculum, right? Like, how do you figure out what you need to put in a curriculum, even in terms of college teaching, what do you need to cover? And I think that sometimes I've found with some of my colleagues, there's this real push to do what's more current, right? And so sometimes people get left out of the syllabus for that reason. There's also, his language is very complicated, and you do have to unpack. I mean, I tell my sentences, okay, follow his thinking, unpack the text, don't write long sentences like him, right? Because there's a strategy to his sentences, and it's not for the faint of heart, right? So there's a way that just you have to really want to take the time, like you're saying, to kind of unpack and to engage it. But I think it's important. I think anything that is going to teach you something is important to unpack in a classroom and in your life as well. So
Thank you so much to both of you for doing an excellent job tonight. Thank you, Megan. Great event, and Patricia, appreciate it. I have a question. I've worked in Harlem 20 years. And at the time, I just kept seeing the names James Baldwin, Mary Douglas, the streets, shops, Malcolm X Boulevard. And at the time, I didn't know what they meant. But everywhere I turned the street or I saw these names. And little by little, I started understanding what they meant. Just a little. And I thank you for being here and enlightening us with the real meaning of the work of James Baldwin. My question is, for someone who's not very knowledgeable about his works, what novels, what works of his do you recommend to start reading? Progressive. I'm very sure that a lot of his work is very complex. So, as you, as an expert on Baldwin, what novels do you recommend to start with?
Well, I would say start with vintage Baldwin, because this is a collection of pieces from different, it's from, right? So some of the essays are there from The Fire This Time, then there's Sonny's Blues, which is from something else, and there's Nobody Knows My Name, then there's something, there are excerpts from a number of his texts. So I would start with this.
What's the title?
Vintage Baldwin. It's published by Vintage Books. And Vintage actually has done a good job of taking a lot of, there's a one on Sandra Cisneros. They've done a good job of taking authors and collecting a number of their texts together. So I would start with this one. But then I would say, when you read them all, no. No, really though. But yeah, I would start with this one.
I like Go Tell It on the Mountain because it was sort of the story of his life. So I think I learned, it was helpful for me because I could then better contextualize the other books that I read. But I'm a sucker for a good memoir.
If I could just add to that too, though, it's also important to have a sense of the Bible when you read Baldwin. Like, it's helpful if you see things to look it up in the Bible because he's invoking a lot of things from the Bible, right? He was a 14-year-old Pentecostal preacher before he, up in Harlem. So I think that's also, if you are a Christian and you know a little bit about the Bible, it will help you to understand even some of the metaphors and different things that he's using.
Well, we would like to thank our panelists. Thank you all for coming out this evening, and we look forward to seeing you on October 16th in the UC Ballroom for our next distinguished lecture. Take good care and have a great night.
Thank you.